Another day, another recap. The wait is finally over, and today I have created a recap of the Maze Runner franchise. This sci-fi action trilogy will include the Maze Runner, the Scorch Trials, and the Death Cure. Without further ado, enjoy the recap. The Maze Runner kicks off with an elevator slowly making its way skyward. Inside it is a young man who awakens and is very distressed. He has no idea where he is, and the elevator keeps taking him up and he hears monsters around him until the elevator finally stops at the top. It goes pitch black inside, then he finally sees the sunlight as well as many people staring at him. Gally jumps down and yanks him out of the elevator and onto the grass. The young lad is very distressed as people surround him, and so he takes off running. Sprinting at full pelt, he eventually stacks it. He stops to look around and cannot believe what he is seeing. They are completely surrounded by gigantic walls. The other boys chuck Greenie inside a makeshift prison. Seems Gally likes the name Greenie and makes sure everyone calls him that. Another man by the name of Albie approaches the cell and pops it open. He asks Greenie if he remembers anything at all, or at least his real name. Greenie says he can't remember a thing and goes into a fright. Albie reassures him, saying it happened to the lot of them, and in a day or two he'll remember his name. He takes Greenie and shows him around, the places where they sleep, eat, and whatever else is necessary. It seems the elevator provides them the necessities to live as well as a new person every single month. Greenie is the new recruit, and Albie says they have never discovered who the people controlling the elevator are. It also appears Albie is the boss, and another man by the name of Newt is second in command. Albie then takes Greenie to the top of a tower they constructed, and shows him the gigantic walls that surround them with a gap in it. He says there are a few rules that he has given everyone, but the most important is to never go beyond the walls. Greenie is then introduced to Chuck, but his curiosity makes him immediately head towards the wall. Two people then come running out from it, and Chuck explains that the only people allowed in the maze are the runners. Greenie, hearing that it is a maze, gets really close to it and has a peep inside. Gally then pushes Greenie and tells him to stay back. Greenie begins shouting, and everyone starts making their way towards him. Albie tells him they can't let him leave, and a massive noise then comes from the wall. Greenie watches as a massive gust of wind approaches him, and the walls suddenly start closing until they are finally sealed shut. That night, the lads have a party and light a massive fire, but Greenie is more interested in the wall and is handed a drink. He almost vomits when he drinks it and seems they don't even know what's inside it. Greenie speaks to Newt, who explains to him that the runners map out the maze, and Mino is the keeper of the runners and is mapping out the maze day in and day out to find a way out. They have been doing this for 3 years now, and the issue they are having is that the maze changes every night. Greenie doesn't believe that's possible, but then hears it moving in the distance. Another problem is that no one has survived a night in the maze from the monsters inside, called grievers. With that, Newt grabs Greenie and shows him some of the other men until Gally tells him let's have a crack. Everyone eggs them on, and the rules are, first one out of the circle loses. Greenie gets tossed around but keeps on going. Gally gets the better of him again, until he gets arrogant and is tipped over by Greenie. Gally trips him over, and Greenie smacks his head. He then has a moment of revelation and remembers his name. He screams, "It's Thomas," and everyone huddles around him and congratulates him, even Gally. But then seems the grievers aren't too happy, and the men call raps on the night. Thomas sits there and has a flashback with some scientists experimenting on him and telling him Wicked is good. He is then awakened by Albie and instructed to walk with him. He tells Thomas there was a lot of chaos and death amongst the boys until order had been established. He also tells Thomas he is unlike the others and is too curious. Handing him a knife, Thomas looks at a wall of names with many scratched off and is told to put his name there. Later on, Newt discusses their previous escape attempts, such as jumping into the elevator or over the maze, but nothing works. Thomas is told to dig up some fertilizer and walks in the middle of the woods. There he finds a trophy-like structure with the name George on it. He sees bones all around him, and then spots a man named Ben looking very oddly at him. Ben runs at Thomas and screams at him, saying it's all his fault. Thomas yells and is getting choked out until he breaks free and goes sprinting through the woods. He screams, and when the others see him, they come and smack Ben to the ground and hold him down. Albie says to lift up his shirt, and they see some sort of infection and say this was not supposed to happen in the middle of the day. Albie says take the man to the pit, and Thomas has no clue what is going on. He speaks with Albie, who explains what happened was a changing, something that happens to someone when they are stung. The infection spreads and the person becomes like a zombie. Thomas then tells Albie that when he was attacked, Ben said all this was his fault. Albie then gets up, and now Thomas sees what happens if you get stung. Ben is placed right in front of the maze doors, and a backpack is thrown into the maze. As the walls start closing, the men are ordered to push him in. They use their spears to push Ben past the wall until he is forced to run through and screams as it seals shut. Everyone remains quiet at the loss of their comrade. With that, they cross Ben's name off the wall. Chuck and Thomas have a conversation, and Chuck says there is no chance that Ben will survive the maze. When Thomas sleeps, he has another memory of a scientist telling him wicked is good. He sees a young girl saying everything is going to change as he gets experimented on and wakes up from his sleep. There, he spots the maze opening and the runners going to do their work. Sometime later, Thomas discusses why Albie went into the maze this time and is told that he wants to trace Ben's footsteps. Newt explains that every month a person comes up from the elevator and that Albie was the first person put in the maze. As time passes, a storm heads their way and they get poured upon by the rain. Thomas worries that the runners and Albie are not back yet and that they should have returned already. But as night is approaching and the sunset is taking place, the three inside the maze have not returned. The gates begin closing and Gally says no one is to enter. Seems they don't want to risk losing anyone else to the maze, and the gates are closing shut when Mino is spotted carrying Albie and is not going to make it back in time. As everyone yells, Thomas gets an intrusive thought and listens to it. He runs through the gates seconds before it is closed shut. Mino calls him a moron, saying he just killed himself. Thomas approaches Albie and sees that he's been stung. They hear a roar from the maze, and Mino tells Thomas to follow him. But Thomas refuses to leave Albie behind no matter what. Mino agrees and they carry Albie as night is just about to hit. They sit him down and the grievers are heard next to them, and Mino wants to make a run for it. Thomas refuses and wants to hide Albie, and Mino begins buckling. He says they are already dead, and Thomas sees the vines on the maze wall and gets an idea. They tie Albie to it and begin raising him as high as they can. They pull him quite high, and Mino sees the griever approaching and says they've got to run and takes off. The griever approaches them and Thomas hides under the vines hanging off the wall. The monstrous beast walks past him but has some mechanical legs, it seems. It runs away and Thomas uses his time to tie the rope and leave Albie high up on the wall as the griever just misses him and walks off. Thomas takes a peep and believes the creature is gone. He hears the maze turning and steps into some gunk. The griever is right above him and he notices on the last second and runs for his life. Problematically though, the grievers know the maze and anticipate almost every turn Thomas does. He keeps sprinting and gets to a dead end. Smartly enough, he scales the wall and keeps running until he reaches the edge of the wall. Cornered, he is forced to jump and grabs onto some vines. The griever follows him, but its weight makes both of them topple to the ground. Thomas is the first to get up and Mino finds him. He says to follow him, and they begin navigating their way through a moving maze. But as the wall is closing, Thomas gets a brilliant idea. He sits and waits for the griever to see him, and when it runs at him, he sprints at full pelt towards Mino and the scene cuts to black. The next morning, the boys wait to see if their friends made it out, but to their disappointment see nobody. As they all turn around to walk off, they look back at the maze to see the trio alive and ask how they made it out alive. Mino says not only did Thomas see a griever, but he also killed it. The community have a council meeting and understand that things are changing. People getting stung in broad daylight and Thomas going into the maze, which is clearly violating their rules. Gally believes they have coexisted with the grievers, and who knows what will happen next. He wants to punish Thomas, but Mino stands up for him, saying when he ran, Thomas stayed to both save Albie and kill a griever. He believes Thomas should be a runner and Gally is not happy. All of a sudden, a massive horn starts blaring out, and it seems the elevator is making its way up weeks early. They quickly find out a girl has joined their ranks. She is carrying a note in her hand saying she is the last one ever. She jolts awake and calls Thomas's name, and everybody immediately looks at Thomas, and Gally really has a vendetta against him now. Newt and Thomas then speak about the note, stressing there will be no more supplies from the elevator, which would kill them off pretty quickly. Thomas wants to head back into the maze, and Mino tells him to relax. He grabs some boys and says these are the new temporary runners. The team immediately go into the maze and straight to the griever. They analyze its remains and see it's a mix of a monster and a robot. They spot a red button ticking in the griever and the crew rip it out. They have no idea what it is but has the number 7 on it. They head back to camp and show Newt their discovery. They now know Wicked has both sent them supplies and created the grievers. Gally still wants a punishment to happen, and Newt sentences Thomas to a night in the pit, and Gally storms off in disappointment. Later on, Mino takes Thomas to a hut in the woods and shows him he has built a replica model of the maze. Turns out they've mapped the whole maze already, but problematically there is no way out. No one else knows this, and Mino explains on the outer sections there are massive walls from numbers 1 to 8. Every night the maze is open, a new section gets opened, and it rotates each day. Surprisingly, section 7 was opened the previous night. The duo is then alerted to the girl waking up and she refuses to speak to anyone until Thomas approaches. He goes up to find a distraught girl and he explains what's happening. She remembers her name immediately, which is Teresa. She knows Thomas's name but nothing else about him or her former life. The two of them speak for quite some time and Teresa tells Thomas she had 2 vials in her pocket when she came up. Thomas takes an educated guess and tells Newt that it might be the antidote for the changing. They inject Albie with the supposed cure and he knocks out. As sundown approaches, it's punishment time for Thomas and Gally escorts him to the pit and locks him up. As the night deepens, Chuck pays Thomas a visit and gives him some food. He holds a little token he has from his parents, something Wicked let him keep. He gives the item to Thomas and says he can't remember his parents anyways, and that at least Thomas has a chance at escaping. Thomas hands the item back to Chuck and says you can give it to them yourself. The next morning, Thomas is released and the maze opens up. Both he and Mino take off sprinting through the maze until they hit the outer walls. They go to number 7, and it should not be open for another week. They find remains of Ben's clothes and the device they have starts crackling. The device seems drawn to a particular point and the duo make their way towards it. Just when they think it's another dead end, the device changes colors, and the walls behind them all open up, revealing something like a tunnel. When they approach it, a red laser scans them up and down and triggers an alarm. A massive horn starts blaring out and the maze starts changing. Everything closes on them and the blades also close. Thomas is forced to follow Mino and barely escapes the blades. Another massive problem happens when the ground beneath them opens up. They can do nothing but sprint for their lives, and the duo barely make it back inside the maze. The other boys crowd around the two when they return. The two believe they found out where the grievers sleep during the day. Gally then shouts at Thomas, telling him he is ruining everything they've accomplished. Thomas says they have accomplished nothing to escape, and just as the two of them get into a heated discussion, Teresa tells them Albie is awake. Everyone makes their way towards him, and he remains silent. There are some tears in his eyes, and he tells them they cannot leave, they won't let us. He says he remembers everything. He remembers Thomas and says he was always their favorite. He continues to say why would Thomas do this and why is he here? Everyone outside screams, and this causes the crew to walk outside and see for themselves that the entrance to the maze did not shut. A massive sound scares them, and another 3 gates open up around them. Thomas barks orders for everyone to do, but here comes the grievers. Everyone attempts to run and hide but get picked off one at a time. As the death toll rises, Gally puts himself and some others in the pit. Some do not make it though, and Thomas tells Albie the grievers are here. They continue to get picked off, and the size of these monsters are crazy. They set one of them ablaze and everyone makes their way into the open field until Albie stacks it. They try to fight back a bit and hide in the nearest place they can find. The griever walks around them, and when the moment is right, it attacks them. Its metal tail grabs Chuck and the boys hold him and play tug-of-war until Albie forces the beast to release him. It then comes back and grabs Albie. Thomas holds him and Albie says to get them out before he is taken away. They run out of the hut and see everything on fire. Gally comes and cracks Thomas in the face, saying he was sent here by them to destroy everything they have. Thomas says he needs to remember just like Albie, and so he stings himself and quickly drops and passes out. He begins remembering, telling Teresa why they are doing this. A woman tells him to come with her. They tell him Wicked is good and he remembers torturing Gally and then wakes up. The bad news continues as Gally has taken control of everyone and is banishing Thomas at sundown. Thomas says that Gally hasn't been too wrong, and tells the people around him that the maze is not a prison but a test, and that he was working with Wicked alongside Teresa. Newt tells Thomas what's happened before the maze was past versions of themselves, and what's important is to find a way out of the maze and to save them now. As sunset approaches, they drop Thomas in front of the gates. Some men voice their opinions and Gally quickly silences them. Teresa says that banishing them will accomplish nothing, and Gally says it's not a banishing, it's an offering. As they go to tie Thomas up, he wakes up and both he and his crew disarm Gally's team. They offer everyone to join them, and Thomas says,
"I'd rather risk my life out there than spending the rest of it in here."
Quite a few join Thomas's ranks, and Gally tells them good luck against the grievers. With that, the team runs through the maze and go directly to the outskirts to find a griever looming around. Thomas gives them a motivational speech, and they all run at the griever and stab it. It roars and kills a man as Chuck grabs the falling key. The others throw the griever down the ditch, but they are quickly attacked by more grievers. The key opens the gate to the escape hatch, but the grievers edge closer towards them and kills a few men. The door needs an 8-coded password, and Mino screams the sequence of the maze. He is then almost eaten by a griever, but his friend sacrifices himself, and when they are almost finished the grievers have them back against the wall, and when the code is complete, the walls begin dropping on the grievers, which kills and traps them. The boys also fall down the escape hatch into darkness. A door then opens up for them, and the remaining survivors make their way down the corridors until they find a room with the word exit on it. Thomas goes through to find an alarm blaring and scientists dead on the ground. They witness dead patients, dead security, and bullet holes all around them. Newt sees the cameras hidden in the maze, and Thomas sees a red button flickering on a screen and presses it. A recording on a monitor shows Ava Page, director of the World Catastrophe Kill Zone Department, announcing the completion of the maze trials. She regrets not being there in person due to urgent circumstances. She explains the Earth has been ravaged by solar flares and scorched to nothing but rubble. This, as well as a lethal virus that erupted called the flare, led to billions losing their lives. The virus is incurable, but a generation may arise that holds the cure, hence the extreme testing of the young. She informs the boys that further trials await and not all agree with their methods. As her facility is overrun and her team eliminated, she utters "Wicked is good" before she too is killed. The team see her lifeless corpse as a door opens up to the outside world. Just as they are all about to make their way out, Gally appears behind them. He's been stung and the virus is playing with his head. He raises a gun at Thomas, and no matter how they try to convince him otherwise, Gally shoots as he is hit by a spear. He drops to the ground, and simultaneously, it seems Gally accidentally shot Chuck. He is put on the floor, and as he's almost about to die, he hands the token his parents gave him to Thomas as he stops breathing. Thomas cries over his lifeless corpse, and the door behind them opens up. Men with guns grab the kids, but Thomas refuses to leave Chuck. The men forcefully drag him outside and tells everyone to board the chopper, which is waiting for them. One of the men inside tells them they're all safe now. The chopper takes off, and now we get to see the full extent and grandiose of the maze from above. Elsewhere, Ava Page cleans the fake blood on her head and says the maze trials were a success. She is especially impressed by Thomas and is happy that the survivors have taken the bait. Ava tells the room it's time to begin Phase 2, and simultaneously, the chopper flies through the rubble and destruction of the world as it cuts to black. In the cold of night, many people are at a train station with masks on. There is a very chaotic scene, and a mother carries her son to the front of the line and says that she will love her son Thomas no matter what. The guards then grab the kid and escort him away. Thomas and multiple other kids are taken by Ava and Wicked, and the experiments begin from here on out. Thomas awakens back in the elevator of the maze, and as he is about to hit the roof, he wakes up to Mino shouting at him. He is ushered by the armed men to run as they shoot zombie-like creatures. All the teenagers are escorted inside to the wall, and the zombies approach as Thomas and his team make it safely. The crew is introduced to Jansen, the man that runs this massive place which he refers to as a sanctuary. He walks with them and elaborates there isn't really a home to go back to, but he has the next best thing, a refuge outside the scorch and out of Wicked's sight. The team finally has their first shower since joining the maze, and are then put up for a medical evaluation. Dr. Crawford is the head of the unit and walks towards Teresa and closes the blinds. Thomas is taken into a sort of interrogation room, and Jansen asks Thomas what he remembers about Wicked and wants to know which side he's on. Thomas does not lie and says the truth of how he worked for them but then ended up in the maze somehow. Jansen is satisfied with the answers and clears Thomas and his team to head to the mess hall. There they find others who also successfully completed the maze. The longest person that has been in the sanctuary is Eris. He's been there for over a week. Jansen makes his way to the center of the room and announces that specific people will be escorted to the refuge. He begins announcing names, and those that get chosen cheer. He finishes his list and says if he could take more he would, but it's out of his hands. The selected group takes off to the safe haven, and Thomas spots Teresa walking by as well. He wants to go through the door until he is stopped by guards. Later, Frypan walks into the new room, and Winston gets the first dibs on a bed he likes. At night, Thomas sits in his bed where he hears a noise from underneath and finds Eris there telling him to come into the vents. They crawl through for some time, and Eris shows him a specific opening to watch from. Suddenly, they spot people being transported into a locked room while they are stationary on a bed. Eris says they do it every night and has only ever seen people go in and never go out. He believes this place is shifty and something is going on. The next day, as Jansen announces the names, Thomas voices his concerns to Newt and says what he saw the previous night. As the selected group make their way into the room, Thomas tries to walk into the room and is halted by the guard. Thomas makes a run for it and is stopped by the guards, and Jansen has to come in to calm everyone down. After locking them in the room, it seems Thomas swiped the guard's card. The crew voices their resentment at his current mission, but he heads off with Eris through the vents and ends up in front of the locked room. He goes inside, and the first thing he spots is krill-like creatures in massive tubes. This must be some sort of laboratory, and the next room gives them chills. They see people being suspended in the air and hooked up to tubes and tanks. Each machine seems to be collecting some blue substance. Eris confirms that these captives are their fellow maze runners, and simultaneously a door opens from behind them. The duo hides and Jansen as well as a doctor enter. The other two watch as Ava Page is on the other line and tells Jansen she wants to arrive sooner than expected. Even though Jansen tells her everything seems to be working, she says not quick enough and wants him to sedate and harvest the rest of the kids immediately. It also appears that Dr. Page is a bit frightened by a group called the Right Arm and says the rebels have hit 2 installations and want the children as much as they do. When the call ends, Thomas sprints back to his group and tells them they need to leave right now. He goes to barricade the door and Jansen makes his way with sedatives to the group. Thomas says it's wicked and has always been wicked. When Jansen goes to open the door, he finds it jammed. The guards break it open and the room is empty. The facility immediately goes into lockdown, and as Eris splits up from the group, the remaining find Dr. Crawford alone. Jansen goes through the cameras and spots his escapees holding Crawford hostage. The group is then shot at and Mino does a 1000 IQ move on their attacker. They grab his gun and go into the med lab to find Teresa in bed. Thomas wakes her up and they sort of barricade the door from Jansen's men. Thomas breaks a window and they all climb through it to find a man standing in front of them. They shoot him and the gun they have is quite a unique one. They sprint through the corridor and when they get stuck, Jansen approaches them from the other side. Jansen tells Thomas the cranks would eat him alive in the real world and tries to convince him to surrender. The door from behind them suddenly opens up with Eris there. Thomas distracts the men and as the main door closes, Thomas slides underneath, and Eris breaks the locks. There's a reason why Thomas was Ava's favorite, and that's why. The team reach the main sanctuary's doors and open it up. They sprint for the sandhills but problematically, Wicked has some quad bikes in pursuit. They hide as far as they can but keep moving until they find some cover. Teresa wants to know what's going on and Thomas explains everything he saw to the group. He makes sure they understand Wicked is after something in their blood. Their new plan is, find the resistance group hiding in the mountains and work out everything from there. The squad then discovers footprints on the ground and go hunting through the busted-up building. They decide to split up and find whatever necessities they need. After finding some freaky mannequins, the group venture forth until Thomas sees something weird inside a cage and Mino simultaneously activates the power to the building. A crank rushes next to them, and another one comes from behind. They are forced to knock out the crank and go sprinting as they are pursued. They shut a door behind them, but everywhere they look there are cranks. The rest of the team see what's going on and everyone goes running at full force. Everywhere they turn they find zombies, but they fend them off and keep making their escape. Newt is jumped but quickly saved as well. The zombie horde chases the team until they find themselves cornered with a locked door next to them. Winston fires a few shots at the cranks and they break the door open. Winston is jumped on by a zombie, and the two sides play tug-o-war with Winston's body, which receives some injuries in the process. The group sprints for their lives once again and Thomas joins them. They run until they find a hiding spot for the night and remain there. The following morning, Thomas is the first to wake up. Everyone else awakens as well, and Winston doesn't look too good. They immediately start their journey, looking to first and foremost get through the scorched city. As they walk, they look at the scenery until Thomas hears something. They all listen and quickly get to cover as massive ships come flying past them, which is obviously looking for them. They continue their journey and make it past the buildings and onto the top of a sandhill. They see the mountains in the distance and that's their goal. Suddenly Winston topples over and Thomas gets the idea of carrying him to the mountains. On the way they have a quick pit stop and Teresa tells Thomas they did something to her neck. She says that her memories were coming back to her, and she tells Thomas the reason why the both of them were working with Wicked was to fix everything. She tells Thomas they should go back and this doesn't sit right with him. She says everything was right until then boom. She doesn't finish her sentence and Winston is out of control. The infection has pretty much taken over his body and Winston wants to die. He refuses to be a crank and the boys accept his wishes and hand him the pistol. They all walk off and before you know it, they all stop when they hear a shot being fired. That night, the crew makes a campfire to keep them warm. They all sit around it in silence, mourning the loss of their dear friend. The next day, they keep traversing the harsh landscape to arrive at the mountains. The conditions are unbearable, and their water supply is running short. They travel until night falls once again. But as they sleep, Thomas wakes up to see lights in the distance and awakens the others. But behind them, a massive storm approaches, and it's time to run. The thunderstorm approaches and shatters all around them, and the dry lightning keeps popping off. When the team get close to the lights, a bolt hits the ground next to Thomas and Mino. Thomas is quite disorientated, and the others help carry Mino inside. They shine a light at Mino, and when he groans, they are happy to hear it. They get him up, then as Teresa turns around, a crank on a leash jumps at her. It appears the entire group is surrounded, and a woman approaches them and walks in between the cranks. She introduces herself as Brenda and tells the group to follow her. They do so but walk past quite a few men, with some even joining them. They are then introduced to the leader of the base, Jorge, who asks what they want. Thomas replies, they are looking for the right arm, and Jorge calls them ghosts. The second question is where they came from, and when the team remains silent they are held down and their necks are scanned by a device. Jorge tells the group they are tagged and came from Wicked. Realizing how valuable they are, he ties them upside down. He comes back for a second meeting in private and tells the team his men want to sell them back to Wicked, but he offers them a deal for information about the right arm. When they blurt out that they're in the mountains, one of Jorge's commanders walks in and the conversation ends. Jorge goes to Brenda and says they're leaving. After some time, one of the guards watching the facility is yanked into the dark. Some Wicked soldiers then appear and make their way inside as the others manage to free Teresa. Wicked begin their silent assault, and then a chopper makes its way onto the scene and blares out on the speakers to return their property. Everyone goes into a fright and Teresa releases the others. Jorge tells Brenda to grab the kids as he plays his favorite song. The kids, though, are being held at gunpoint, and the man alerts Jansen to the kids' whereabouts. As the crazed man goes to pull the trigger on Thomas, he is instead shot in the back by Brenda. They all follow her, but Teresa picks up the dead man's walkie-talkie before joining the others. Jorge plays a song on the facility speakers and tells Brenda it's go time. They start ziplining themselves from one building to another and Jansen sees this. Brenda takes off to grab something she left and Thomas chases her. Problematically, the two are then stuck inside with the Wicked agents. They put themselves in a position that the enemy won't shoot or risk killing them. Once the song finishes, the entire facility erupts in flames. The support structure begins breaking and the two go down the elevator shaft and barely jump out of the way. It appears the duo are trapped and the only way out is through the crank-infected sewage tunnels. They silently make their way through the tunnels, and when Thomas finds an exit, Brenda walks the other way to find a rotting hive of cranks. They seem dead, and a rat then pops out of nowhere. It is grabbed by one of the dead cranks and the rest of them awaken as well. They all run towards the rat and realize there are humans near, and start chasing the duo. The two of them make their way outside and almost fall off a cliff. Cornered, they start climbing the rubble and enter a building almost ready to collapse. Brenda kills one crank running at them, but there are still two more. They begin climbing some stairs and the cranks are more athletic than the average person. Brenda takes care of it though, and continues until she accidentally tumbles onto the window of a building about to collapse. The window cracks at any weight Brenda puts on it. The crank then shows itself and just dives on Brenda. The window is nearly broken, and Thomas grabs Brenda and cracks the glass underneath her. They safely make it out of the building, but very problematically, Brenda has been infected by the crank. The duo continues their journey and finds some other survivors. They make their way to what looks like a party. The host of the event, named Blondie, tells the pair that to enter they must drink his drink. They do it, and he tells them have fun. Within seconds, Thomas trips out on himself and sees some weird things. He goes around the place and quickly drops to the floor and passes out. He awakens soon enough to find Teresa in front of him. Jorge is interrogating Blondie, whose real name is actually Marcus. Jorge wants the location of the red arm, and Marcus just laughs and plays around as he gets belted. Eventually, he admits and says there is an outpost in the mountains. The new and improved team steals the man's car and heads straight to the mountains. They are eventually blocked by broken down cars and have to walk on foot to finish their journey, but out of nowhere, the team hide behind the cars and are stuck there. Jorge hands Thomas an explosive device, and as Thomas is about to throw it, they are held at gunpoint by two women. The girls hold the entire group at the tip of her gun, and surprisingly, the girls know Eris. It turns out, as Teresa was thrown into a boys-only maze, Eris was thrown into a girls-only maze. Harriet and Sonia call off the other snipers and they lead the team to the Right Arm Command Center. Sonia tells the other runners they are leaving at first light. Now they get introduced to the big boss, Vince. He isn't too sure how he feels about the newcomers, and says to check them as Brenda simultaneously hits the ground. Vince sees that she has been infected and goes to kill her. Thomas pleads with him, and as he is about to shoot, a woman named Mary tells him to stop. She tells Vince that Thomas can save her and knows his name. Confused, she goes to tell everyone that she's surprised he's not dead after what he did. As it turns out, when Thomas was working for Wicked, he relayed the locations of all the compounds, trials, and labs that Wicked owned to the Right Arm. Vince calls Thomas the Source, and it seems all the Red Army have accomplished was because of him. Immediately after that, Mary takes some of Thomas's blood and explains she used to work for Wicked, and they found a sort of cure to slow down the virus. But it was only found in the new generation and could only be harvested from them. Teresa watches this from outside the tent, and Mary injects Brenda with the cure. She tells Thomas that every few months Brenda needs more and more of the cure to survive. Some while later, Brenda wakes up to see Thomas holding her stuff. The two of them get into a heart-to-heart conversation, with Thomas showing her the item Chuck left for him to watch over. Jorge gets a bit emotional and gives Thomas a big hug for saving Brenda. Thomas sits with Mino, Newt, and Frypan. They reminisce over the friends that died so that they could come here. Thomas then sees Teresa standing at the edge of a cliff staring into the distance. She gets quite emotional, speaking on her mother and how she was forced to watch her turn into a crank. She knows this happened to billions of others, and that's why she done what she done, and apologizes to Thomas. She refuses to let the world suffer, and choppers are seen in the distance. Teresa seems to be a ratbag snitch, and Thomas runs to warn the others in disgust. But it's too late. The choppers decimate the entire camp and Jansen is leading the charge. The units drop on the ground and begin stunning everyone there. Vince tries to do what he can, and the small group tries their best. Thomas watches this and Brenda grabs him, and they hide. Jorge tells him there is no chance at helping his friends. The enemy then throws a bomb that stuns all people in its parameters. Thomas, Brenda, and Jorge are the last ones not captured. But as usual, Thomas refuses to leave, and when the others depart, he gets a plan. Everyone at the camp is seated on the ground, and Wicked scans the kids' necks. Jansen asks where Thomas is, and he shows himself. They place him with the others, and Jansen tells his man to bring her in. Thomas tells Mino he is tired of running, and simultaneously, a massive ship approaches from the sky and lands. When the back opens, Ava Page walks out and speaks to Jansen, who tells her they have all of the kids they lost. She tells him to load them on the ship, and Thomas goes face to face with her. Ava says thank you to Teresa and Mino, and the others taste betrayal and now know what it means to be a ratbag. As she mouths off and apologizes, Thomas and his crew eye her out. Mary then comes into the picture, and Dr. Ava immediately kills her. Vince goes ballistic at them, and as they turn their backs, Thomas takes out a trigger and tells them all to stop. Teresa tells Thomas to stop, but he silences her. His squad then stand behind him, all ready to die. Teresa sees the stupidity in her ways, and Ava tells him to stop. As he goes to pull the trigger, a truck comes blaring in and runs into a chopper that causes much chaos. Everyone starts fighting back, and Thomas throws the bomb at the troops. Jorge saves the day, and Brenda saves Thomas from Jansen. Everyone tries their best to fight back, and Vince gets onto a machine gun and starts decimating the enemies. Mino provides cover fire for many to escape, but he is shot and cannot move as the enemies take him away. Thomas can only watch as Wicked jump into the massive ship together with all the snakes and ratbags on board before the chopper takes off. He stands in disbelief, and the scene cuts to the next day. The carnage is something unseen, and a lot of them cannot believe what just happened. Vince says he wants to take the kids to the safe haven and start over with what's left. Thomas as usual refuses and says he is staying to fight. He also refuses to let Mino be taken and tortured. Newt tells him that this is an impossible mission, and Jorge agrees. Nonetheless, he is willing to die for both Mino and the rest of the fellow runners captured. He will not let Wicked get away with it this time, and wants to put a bullet into Ava Page. The remaining survivors say that was a good speech, and what's the plan? The third and final masterpiece of the Maze Runner franchise opens up with a car gunning down a dirt road. The vehicle stops, and both Jorge and Brenda are inside. They hear a train approaching them, and it is go time. The vehicle lines up next to the train where Mino and many other runners are locked up inside. Jorge floors his car until he gets face to face with the head of the train, and meanwhile, Vince and Thomas approach from the other side. The Wicked agents call in the hit, and reinforcements are en route. Jorge is shot at, and Thomas hooks a chain on the last carriage, and Vince can also board the train. They spot a bird in the sky who advises the train to their welcomers. The chopper opens fire on Jorge, who manages to dodge the attacks and speed off. Thomas and Vince then jump on top of the carriages, and Wicked agents make their way towards them. Thomas distracts the agents, and Vince lights a fuse that separates the train from the carriages in the back. Their reinforcements have been waiting, and the screaming of kids inside alerts Newt where to drill. Wicked soldiers from the train run towards them, and Jorge is still being chased down by the aircraft. Suddenly, they stop and are held at machine gun range and ordered to exit the vehicle. The Wicked agents all get out to arrest the duo, who take a step back. Then boom, it's a trap. The right arm also catches the pilot off guard as the others are shot at from a distance. Newt finishes his work, and everyone makes their way onto the roof of the carriage. Suddenly, the aircraft manned by Jorge unloads a hook. It is tied to the carriage and lifted off the ground. The agents watch in disbelief as this was a very successful mission completed. After finally popping open the carriage door, Thomas spots many runners locked up. But problematically, Mino isn't there. The others are freed, and Vince gives them all a speech. He makes sure they understand their troubles are not over yet, and he plans to get a massive ship working in a couple days to hide in a remote island hidden to the world. Jorge asks Brenda if her bite mark is playing up, and she says not one bit. Thomas tries to get as much info as possible from Eris, but the only thing he discovers is that Wicked were constantly talking about a city. At the train, Jansen finds out about the attack, and his annoyance is somewhat resolved when he sees Mino and knows that Thomas will come for him. Thomas, meanwhile, uses all available information to roughly map out where the city is. Vince refuses to risk the lives of all the runners they just saved. Jorge confirms that the location is known as the Last City and is the Lion's Den. Vince says he will not go, and simultaneously, their radio turns on and they turn off the lights. They barely manage to go undetected as the wicked aircraft search for them. Deep into the night, Thomas sneaks off and is quickly discovered by Newt. He wants to be in the mission and so does Frypan. In the meantime, Mino is kicking back, laying on some grass. Confused, he looks up to see he's back in the maze. He finds it exactly where he left off and sees some people in the distance. A child then runs past him and Mino follows him and ends up on the exit hallway. He hears something next to him and spots a griever. He sprints for his life but has no clue where to run. It tracks him and he suddenly stops moving and gets pinned on the roof. The griever makes its way towards him and roars in his face as he is being watched by wicked doctors while tied up in a chair. This is their new method of collecting the supposed cure, and Mino does not look too well. From the window, Teresa stands beside Ava Page and watches her former friend be tortured. Back with the original trio, they drive through Countryland and find themselves in a restricted area. There is a blacked-out tunnel ahead, and I can guarantee you there are some cranks inside. Without a choice, they slowly make their way through the tunnel. Then suddenly, Frypan stops when he spots a crank ahead. Thomas says to move forward and a woman unexpectedly pleads for his help. Cranks are quickly drawn to the noise and Frypan hits the accelerator and one crank stays on the car until it is eventually smashed off. Frypan doesn't pay attention to what's in front of him and flips the car over. The crew quickly get out but here comes the cranks. Frypan kills the first one but the others start running at them. When the team sprints for it, they realize they're trapped by both sides. Cornered, they await their demise until Brenda and Jorge arrive and save the day. Within minutes, the entire team see what they've been looking for. A massive city walled off to protect themselves from the cranks and others. It is quite a sight to behold, and inside the city, Teresa is with Dr. Ava as they walk into a boardroom meeting. Ava explains to the owners of the city and Wicked that infections are up 300%. But fortunately, they are almost at a breakthrough. Mino has the best antibodies ever seen and the boardroom are unconvinced. Teresa then barks her way into the conversation and tells the members that safe zones will only slow down the problem, but never finish the job. She continues to use her snake-like tongue, and with that, the meeting ends. Meanwhile, the others approach the city walls and see armed men speak their mind about the evil of Wicked. While this happens, a drone scans the area to find Thomas's tag, and my man is a level 5 fugitive, quite a hard level to get to. Protests happen outside the city walls, with many asking to enter the safe city. A masked man meanwhile watches the team and Jansen heads into the base of operations to see Thomas at the protest. He says to get the guns online and within seconds massive turrets begin opening up on the wall. Everyone starts sprinting and the turrets open fire and try killing Thomas. They kill many protesters and Thomas's crew are quickly grabbed by the masked men and put into vans. Jansen tells his men to search the wreckage for Thomas, but little do they know he is escorted into a building filled with these masked men. Jorge starts belting a man and stops when he sees Brenda is okay. And now comes the moment of truth. One of the masked men takes off his mask to reveal it is Gally. Thomas immediately whacks him and blames him for Chuck's death. Newt stops him and reminds him that Gally was half out of his mind when he pulled the trigger. Gally says he never died and was instead left by them to die. Newt explains to Gally that Mino is being held up inside Wicked, and Gally says he can help. He explains this rebel group picked him up and discovered he was an immune. They have been at war with Wicked since they overtook the city, but their day is coming. He then introduces the group to the big man, Lawrence. Lawrence hears the group's intentions and says getting into the city is one thing but getting into Wicked is another. Thomas promises him he can get inside and Lawrence agrees but tells him that only 2 can head into the city as a precaution. They shake hands and Gally immediately shows them a secret tunnel. Accompanying him is both Newt and Thomas. Meanwhile, Teresa enters a lab to find a child laying on the bed, clearly infected. Teresa injects her with the supposed cure and waits for the results. A while later, Jansen even seems quite happy with the outcome of the test. Gally and the other 2 make their way into the city and simply walk amongst the people. They see how splendid and futuristic it actually is, and Wicked alerts everyone to a mandatory curfew. They silently walk around without being spotted, and Gally realizes that the extra security is probably because of Thomas. The trio get really high up and make it to the city's outer walls. There, Gally reveals Wicked's base of command. Lawrence has been trying for years to enter the building, but it's impossible. However, there is one little chink in their armor, Teresa. Thomas does not like the plan one bit and voices his opinion. Newt all of a sudden snaps. He tells Thomas this was never just about Mino, it was about Teresa. He then stops and knows he messed up and walks outside. There, he reveals to Thomas he has been bit, and Thomas comes up with plans to save him. But Newt silences him and says do not worry about him, just worry about Mino. Back at Wicked, Mino goes face to face with Teresa and looks very off. He doesn't respond to Teresa, and even when she says that he might have saved a little girl's life and their experiments are working, he remains silent still, and as she is about to leave he whispers something. She walks to him and...
"A traitor!"
The guards quickly jump in the room, and he steals something from the table as he is jumped on, but there's more trouble now. Teresa goes to see that the young girl is turning into a crank. With disappointment she heads off. On her way home she sees Thomas and trips out. Not knowing if it's him for sure, she follows him. Eventually, he leads her to a remote area and reveals himself. He tells her he had to see her and must ask her a question.
"Do you regret it? What she did to us?"
She says she would do it again, and he's happy to hear it as Gally bags her up. The scene then cuts to Ava and Jansen having a discussion. Ava has practically given up and tells Jansen there is no hope, as the virus is now airborne. They have about 1 month left, and she regrets putting the kids through all that pain and suffering for no reason. At the rebel hideout, Teresa is unmasked and Gally gets right to it. He wants to know where Mino is, and she immediately spits out all the information they want to know. Thomas then forces her to cut out all the tags in their necks. Jorge is handed keys by Brenda and has an important task he must do. Teresa sees that Brenda looks quite good and asks how Thomas has been giving her serum. He says he hasn't given it to her since she was infected. Teresa stops and says that's not possible, and Brenda should have turned by now. He doesn't want to hear it and specifically doesn't want to hear her. She then goes on to put the blood tissue into her pocket. Later, the mission begins, and Newt in wicked clothing escorts Teresa through the main doors and is stopped by a guard. Turns out it was just Thomas, and they link up with Gally. The trio, guided by Teresa, make their way into a restricted area. Gally starts breaking into the electrical system as Frypan climbs a crane and Brenda is at the bus depot. Gally places a device into the wicked system, and Lawrence cannot believe that the boys just pulled it off. The three of them head to where the runners are being held and take care of all assailants in the room. Newt tells the runners they are free, and after all are released, Gally says he needs a while to break into the vault. Mino is also not in the room, and it seems someone has moved him to the medical wing. Newt along with Thomas head off and Gally stays drilling. They end up boarding an elevator, and to their surprise, Jansen jumps in. He tells Teresa that Thomas is near the city, and that Ava wanted to keep it a secret from her. When exiting the elevator, Thomas gives Jansen a nudge and walks off. Teresa then speaks to Thomas and tells him that his blood is unique. It doesn't just give people time, it cures them. Thomas loses it and tells her she is wrong, but it seems Jansen picked up what was going on. He says Thomas does not have it in him to shoot Teresa and plays his bluff. Teresa shoves Thomas and Newt inside and locks the door on him. She tells Jansen that she did him a favor and that they are now trapped inside. Kelly in the meantime grabs the vials and tells the kids it's time to move out. He takes the kids to the car park and Brenda is there with a bus. Gally realizes Thomas isn't back yet and tells Brenda to wait for him. The entire building goes into lockdown mode, and in the car park, a wicked agent spots the bus and thinks something is off. He approaches it slowly, and Brenda has no option but to floor it. She rams the gates and is now on the street. In the meantime, Thomas spots Dr. Ava, but before anything happens, Jansen interferes. The duo screams out for Mino, and Mino is not as easy to control as they think. He takes out the first doctor, then the guard. The main doctor gets a taste of his own medicine, and the duo are getting cornered from Jansen's men. A stun grenade buys them some time, and Mino finally shows himself. The three hug it out and quickly continue their escape. Jansen corners the trio and they hide inside a room. Trapped, they block the door, and if that opens, they are done for. Thomas breaks the glass window behind him to see a pool underneath. As the door opens, the trio risks their lives and jump from the building into the pool. Jansen cannot believe it, but the three of them have survived, and Thomas gives Jansen a message to remember him by. But problematically, 4 guards have them held at gunpoint. Out of nowhere, one of the guards stuns the other 3, and it turns out to be Gally, who does not believe how crazy the trio are. Outside the building, Brenda realizes she's in a tough spot and causes some wicked cars to collide. But there are way too many agents after her, and she is trapped from both sides. As she gets out of the vehicle, they scream at her to lay on the ground, but instead she shoots a flare into the air. Frypan sees the signal, and when a crane drops, Brenda ties it on the bus and it is lifted skyward. Frypan takes the kids over the entire city, and the bus almost separates from the crane. Frypan quickly drops it, and it breaks a couple meters off the ground and slowly lands perfectly. Brenda cannot believe how fortunate they are, and Jansen is feeling the complete opposite right now. Their runners and vials were stolen, and Jansen says it's not over yet. Teresa is back in the lab and runs a test on Thomas's blood. She knows that it's the cure, and Brenda makes it back to Lawrence's rebel group, but everyone is missing. It turns out every single one of them are armed to the teeth, and Lawrence tells his group that today is the day. He tells everyone that Wicked started the war and they will end it. He tells his driver to head out, and he drives his truck towards the city gates. Wicked tries to shoot him, But the rebels have hacked Wicked's systems and Lawrence goes headfirst into the wall to cause a massive explosion. Gally and the crew sees this, and Gally says this was not the plan. In the lab, Ava tells Teresa they need to leave, and Teresa tells Ava to have a look at Thomas's blood. It turns out it's not just slowing the virus down but actually killing it. On the street, the 4 of the runners are caught in the middle of the street. The rebels attack from one side and Wicked from the other. It is a war scene, with bullets flying all over the place. Thomas gets into contact with Brenda and says he's not going to make it. She refuses to leave him, and out of nowhere, she tells Thomas she's coming to him, and that their ride has arrived. The once beautiful city, now a mixture of flames and blood, burns with the rebels and Wicked fighting. Thomas sees the chopper and tells Newt it's time to go, but he says he cannot make it. Thomas tells Mino he needs to run to Brenda, grab the serum and bring it back. Newt tells Mino thank you and he is getting really bad. His senses start playing on him and he forces Thomas to take his necklace. Thomas does so and Newt does not want to get up. But Thomas will not let his friend die and carries him through the gunfire. Within seconds, Newt drops to the ground and is not breathing right. Suddenly, Teresa begins speaking on the city speakers. She tells Thomas that he has no reason to trust her, but she needs him to come back. She says Brenda isn't sick anymore because his blood is the actual cure. He can save Newt and the rest of the world. Newt then stands up and turns around to reveal he has turned. He attacks Thomas and Mino makes it to the ship to grab the serum. Newt pleads for Thomas to kill him, but he will not do it. Newt tries it himself, but Thomas saves him. He jumps between the crank and himself and Brenda sprints through the streets, but it's too late. Newt has managed to finish the job with a knife in his chest as he drops. A tear drops from his eyes as he dies, and Brenda sees this happening. Thomas picks up the gun from the ground and walks the other way alone. Gally and the others look over Newt's body and their hearts break. Inside Wicked, Thomas holds Ava at gunpoint with tears streaking down his face. Ava tells Thomas he is the key to solving everything. The gun is withdrawn, and Ava actually carries regret in her eyes. She promises to leave the other runners alone and... Ava drops dead and Jansen walks towards Thomas with his gun raised at him. He pricks Thomas, who instantly drops to the ground and sees Ava's lifeless corpse before passing out. He soon awakens to find Teresa extracting his blood. Jansen watches his city fall and Thomas is strapped to the chair. Jansen intends on sucking the life out of Thomas and cure those that he chooses. It seems that he was also hit by a crank and Teresa whacks him over the head and unstraps Thomas. Jansen then throws her around and wants the cure, but Thomas tackles him through some glass and has a mad crack with him. Both seem to be quite ruthless in their assault, but Thomas stops at the sight of a gun. From behind, 2 massive rockets hit the building and it seems the rebels below want to drop it to the ground. Thomas is fired at but evades capture and quickly realizes he's been shot. He sits on the ground and Teresa helps stop the bleeding. Jansen then makes his way inside the laboratory, knowing the 2 are hiding from him. Not much to work with, Jansen finds Teresa on the ground. She tells him just take the serum and leave them be. He can't stand Thomas and wants him to understand he's a lab rat. As he is about to fire, Thomas throws something at him but misses. Thomas laughs as the glass behind Jansen breaks and the cranks begin digging into him. The other 2 quickly escape the lab and head to the top of the building. As flames surround the pair, they are doomed to die. Thomas drops on the floor and Teresa cries. She apologizes for everything she's done to him, but out of nowhere, Jorge and the crew spot them atop the building. Jorge cannot land and opens the back. The duo walk towards the ship as the building is about to topple. Thomas cannot reach them, and the building next to them drops. Thomas is finally pushed onto the aircraft, and when it comes to Teresa's turn, it is too late for her. She stares at Thomas and falls with the building. They can do nothing for her at this point, and with that, the ship takes off. Thomas passes out and the last city finally falls. Later, Thomas wakes up inside a hut. In pain, he sees his bullet wound has been patched up and he walks outside to see Vince has finished rebuilding the ship and the survivors living a peaceful life. All this was made possible by Thomas, who reunites with everyone that helped and saved him. And most importantly, Mino is finally free. That night, Vince gives a speech to everyone, saying that this island is the future of humanity, and the rock behind him is for the ones they lost along the way. He welcomes all to the safe haven, and finally, everyone can finally taste peace. Mino hands Thomas the necklace Newt left with him and leaves him be. Thomas holds Newt's necklace and realizes there's a note inside. He opens it and almost breaks down in tears. Newt pretty much tells Thomas he is not scared of dying. He is scared about losing himself, forgetting the ones he loved. He mentions stories on all the boys in the maze, but says Thomas's was the best. The second he saw him, he knew he was going to follow Thomas anywhere. He wants Thomas to not regret a single thing that happened and always do what's right. The next day, Thomas inscribes Teresa's name alongside the others that didn't make it. And with that, he takes a walk on the beach and stares at the vial Teresa gave him before she died. His mission isn't over quite yet, and the franchise comes to an end. If you stuck around this long, I congratulate you.
Thank you for watching. Subscribe us for more videos.